These notes go with Mendelian Genetics Part 3, notes pages 24B and 25B. If you'll get those out and just annotate as we go along. Okay, this is showing a pedigree chart for a dominant trait. And in this case, the dominant trait that we're showing is widow's peak. Widow's peak, that means that your hairline goes down into a point, and that is the dominant trait. So in regards to that, we're talking about complete dominance. So that would be represented by a capital W, as opposed to not having widow's peak, which is a straight hairline, and it would be represented by a lowercase w. Now, a pedigree chart is basically just showing you a family history of how your traits occur, and they just put that in chart form. So a few things for you to remember in regards to that is that if it is a square, that is demonstrating a male. Circle is referencing a female. Now, when I was taught how to do this, if we saw that a square was, they told us to remember that because it represents a shield, and think about a shield in battle to represent males, and that a female would be represented by a circular mirror. Now, that is kind of gender biased, and in 2018, probably not politically correct, but if it helps you to remember it, then use that. Okay, if whatever trait that we're looking at, if the individual has that, it will actually be shaded in. So if it is shaded in, that means that they are affected, that trait is present. If it is empty, then that means that they do not have that trait. If it is half shaded, like this, then that means that they are a carrier for that trait. Lines that go straight across are representing mates. And then if those lines go down and then branch off in this way from the top, those are showing siblings. They're offspring of the parents from the previous generation. Okay, so if we look at this particular Punnett square, you have, so we see in the F1 generation, the first generation, we see a dad here that has widow's peak and a mom that does not. They have 4 children. They have a daughter that has widow's peak and a son that does. But they also have 2 sons that do not have widow's peak. Now, this son gets married to a female, has 2 children with a female that has widow's peak. And so they show you this other family over here so that you can see her history as well. And those 2 individuals have 2 children, 2 daughters, one with widow's peak and one without widow's peak. Okay, so they're just showing you all of those comparisons, how they all relate to each other. Now, question, how does this person relate to this person? All right, they are sisters, okay, and they came from these parents up here. Okay, so that is a dominant trait. Now, you can also use a Punnett square with something that is recessive. So in this case, the recessive trait is the attached earlobe. And if you look at the pictures there, attached just means that it attaches directly to the head, as opposed to a free earlobe, which means that it hangs. So attached earlobe is actually a recessive trait, which would be represented by a lowercase f, whereas free earlobe is going to be represented by an uppercase F, because this again is complete dominance. All right, so when we're looking at this, we can see that in this first generation, you had 2 parents here who both had free earlobes. However, they have offspring that 50% of their children have attached earlobes. So for that reason, we know that they've got to be heterozygous, because if they were homozygous for free earlobes, then all of their children would also be homozygous for free earlobes. So you can look through there and see the occurrence of free and attached earlobes through these 2 families, and then how they are joined here by this couple. Now, in referencing recessive disorders, you have 3 listed here on your paper: cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, and sickle cell disease. And just to kind of give you an idea, okay, you have several recessive disorders listed there on your paper: cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, and sickle cell. So I'm giving you a Punnett square right here. This is really, I use the letter D for disorders. And if it is a recessive disorder, this Punnett square could apply for all of those. If you have a heterozygous trait, that means that they are carriers for the disorder. And generally what that means is they may not even have any symptoms of it and not even realize that they are carriers. This is actually the case in cystic fibrosis, is that they don't have any symptoms of the disorder, but they are carriers for it and can pass it on to their children. And if 2 carriers had children, they would have a 25% chance of having a child that was completely normal, did not carry the allele for a disorder like this, a recessive disorder. They would have a 50% chance of having children that were carriers, and then they would have a 25% chance of having a child that does have a recessive disorder. So this is a Punnett square that could be used for cystic fibrosis or any of the recessive disorders that are listed there. So what exactly is cystic fibrosis? Cystic fibrosis is often referred to as CF, and it's the most common lethal genetic disease. It affects 1 out of every 2,500 births. And it's a scary statistic, but 1 out of every 25 Caucasians is actually a carrier of cystic fibrosis. And while they may not have the symptoms, may not even know that they are a carrier, they are able to pass those traits down to their children. So what the problem is that they have a faulty chloride ion protein carrier on their cell membranes. And so whereas that usually gets rid of excess water and mucus inside the airway, in this case it does not function. So a normal airway would look like this. It would be clear, leaving room for gas exchange. But in an individual with cystic fibrosis, you're going to have lots of mucus, lots of fluid, even blood buildup. It also affects the digestive system in this way. Mucus will build up there. They have lots of infections, often require lots of hospitalizations because of that. And there is no cure because it is a genetic disorder. Life expectancy is usually the teens or young adulthood. They do take a lot of medicines and try to manage things that way to increase life expectancy. They will take breathing treatments and often do percussion exercises, which means that they lay with their head lower than their feet. And after they take their breathing treatment, they'll beat on their back to try to loosen any mucus, and then they'll deep breathe and cough real heavily to try to get up any of that mucus and help them spit that out. This is basically just picture form of the Punnett square that I just showed you. You can have a normal individual with 2 normal genes, like right here. But if you have 2 carriers, as in here, that may, again, not even know that they're carriers of the trait, they have a 25% chance of having a child that's completely normal, 50% of having carriers, and then a 25% of having a child with cystic fibrosis that would have both recessive traits. Okay, now Tay-Sachs disease is another disorder that is recessive in nature, and this is caused by a non-functional lysosomes in the brain cells. Now, brain cells require a lot of energy to function, and they get most of that energy from breaking down lipids. The lysosomes will help to break down the lipids and use them for cellular respiration. In Tay-Sachs disease, they do not have functional lipids. They're not able to, the enzyme that does this within the lysosomes, I meant to say functional lysosomes. The enzyme within this that helps to break down those lipids is not present or not functioning. So basically lipids begin to accumulate up inside the brain tissue, and the cells inside the brain will fill up with lipids, and then they'll die. This is most commonly seen in people of Jewish ancestry, although it is often seen in people of Irish descent as well, as are featured here in the video that you'll be watching. Life expectancy is age 5 or less. The children are born appearing to be completely normal, but as they get older and the lipids have time to accumulate within the brain tissue, they will begin to basically regress. Now, the video, for whatever reason, will not play off my PowerPoint on Doceri, this program that I'm using. So I'm going to link this video also in Google Classroom so that you can watch it at a later time. So this, again, is carried as a recessive trait. So this would be, you'd have to be homozygous recessive to be born with the disorder. Okay, now in sickle cell disease, this is the most common genetic disorder within people primarily of African descent, although other populations can get it as well. That is where it is most common. It affects 1 out of every 400 births. And what happens is you have a mutation that causes the 6th amino acid here in this protein to be incorrect. So the protein that helps to make red blood cells. Now, you can have sickle cell disorder, which means if we were using a lowercase s to represent the recessive trait, then sickle cell disorder means that you would be homozygous little s's, okay? You could be big S, and that means you would not be a carrier, nor would you have the disorder. Big S, little s is a carrier, as heterozygous traits are here. But it is unique in the way that I guess, the advantages that they have compared to the other traits. They consider in sickle cell them to have heterozygous advantage. And what that means is that they have an advantage over individuals that are homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. Now, the reason they have an advantage over homozygous dominant is because they are actually resistant to malaria. Homozygous dominant does not have a resistance to malaria. Now, these carriers that have sickle cell trait, they call it having sickle cell trait, they're carriers, don't really have symptoms of sickle cell disease, but they are resistant to malaria, which comes along with sickle cell disease. They have an advantage over the people with sickle cell disease because even though they are also resistant to malaria, they have a disorder to deal with. Those that are carriers or have the trait are resistant to malaria, plus they don't have sickle cell disorder. So we call that, again, heterozygous advantage. The bad thing about having sickle cell disease, there's a couple of things, is that it makes your red blood cells sickle-shaped. That is going to cause the red blood cells to not be able to carry oxygen as efficiently. It is, and that is their primary job. It's also going to make create a lot of pain. Because the red blood cells are often pointed on the end, they will get stuck into the sides, the walls of the blood vessels, and it does create pain. So oftentimes they will require hospitalization to help with pain or with low oxygen levels, and they'll have to go into the hospital for a time. Now, those 3 disorders were recessive disorders, but there are some pretty serious disorders that are also found on as a dominant trait when we're talking about complete dominance. So let's use the letter D again, and let's say that we used our heterozygous alleles again, or genotypes. Okay, so this again would be our Punnett square, but this time our disorder is actually the dominant trait. So it's going to be the big D, okay? So here, because it's dominant, this individual here would actually have symptoms of the disorder. So if you had these 2 heterozygous individuals, you would have a 25% chance of having a child full-fledged with a disorder. And oftentimes, if it's homozygous dominant, it is considered lethal rather than just them having the disorder. It's generally more serious. They'll have a 50% chance of having heterozygous, and they will have this disorder because it's complete dominance, and that capital letter there is going to dominate over the lowercase. Or they could have a 25% chance of them not having the disorder. Remember, this is on the dominant trait. So basically, 75% of their offspring would have the disorder, whereas 25% would not. Now, this is the case in achondroplasia, which is basically referred to as genetic dwarfism. It affects 1 in every 10,000 births. Most people are homozygous recessive, meaning that, and so therefore they tend to be much taller than these individuals. And this just shows you the Punnett squares associated with achondroplasia, and it shows you right here that if they have a homozygous dominant, oftentimes that is lethal even in this case, okay? But if you had one parent with achondroplasia and one parent without, there would still be a 50% chance that they could have a child with achondroplasia. The last dominant disorder that's mentioned in your notes is Huntington's disease. And Huntington's disease is a disorder that affects 1 out of every 10,000 births. It is a slow degenerative disorder that affects the brain and is almost always going to be fatal. Now, one of the difficult things about this disorder is that your notes say it's usually diagnosed in the 40s or 50s. Our anatomy notes say that there are cases at times when it's diagnosed in the 30s as well. But because it is such a late onset, many of these individuals have already had children and don't even know that they have the disorder. So in this Punnett square, it's showing you a father that does not have the disorder, because remember, this is dominant, so the capital H is the Huntington's allele. The mother does have the allele, okay, because she is big H, little h, so she is heterozygous. She is probably going to she'll develop Huntington's disease. And even though she is not homozygous, she is heterozygous, they have a 50% chance of passing this on to their children. But like I said, oftentimes because it is so late in diagnosis, being diagnosed, they've often had kids before they even realize that there is a possibility there. Now, there is a video that talks about Huntington's disease too that I would like for you to watch. It won't pull up in Doceri in this program for me, so I will link it with this assignment as well. There are some other things that are mentioned on your notes. It mentions multifactorial diseases. These are considered epigenetics, and what that means is that there are plenty of things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, even alcoholism that we know have a genetic component. There can be a gene that predisposes you to those things. But we also know that lifestyle choices, environment, all those things can play a factor into your development of those disorders too. Not just the genetics themselves. Like, for example, heart disease. You may carry a gene that predisposes you to having heart disease. But we also know that if you have a diet that is high in fat, or if you drink alcohol or you smoke, those are also going to increase your risk even further. And those can even cause heart disease in people that don't have a gene for that. The same thing is true of diabetes, cancer, alcoholism. There are lots of external things that can put you at a greater risk for developing those disorders. Penetrance is referring to the proportion of individuals with a given genotype that actually show the expected phenotype. For example, in the case of Huntington's disease, big H, little h, we know that this is complete dominance, and so since it is on a dominant allele, this individual should, by their genotype, have Huntington's disease. Actually, the rate of penetrance for an individual with the big H, little h genotype is only 95%, in that 5%, for whatever reason, do not show symptoms of the disease. So we say that there's a 95% penetrance for that allele, for the genotype of big H, little h. And then expressivity is the degree to which a genotype is expressed in an individual. For example, what I mean by that is how serious are the symptoms. In cases like the achondroplasia that we talked about, the genetic dwarfism, if an individual is heterozygous, their symptoms tend to not be as severe as someone who is homozygous. So the expressivity there would be more serious in an individual that was homozygous for achondroplasia, two dominant letters, big H, or whatever, rather than somebody that is heterozygous for that trait.